The cameras were rolling. The lights, blazing and sharp, cast a glow that felt more like prophecy than production. Millions tuned in, not for entertainment, not for politics, but for something deeper. In one chair sat Bishop T.D. Jakes, the spiritual giant of American Christianity, a voice of hope for generations. Across from him sat a man younger in years but ancient in conviction, Ibrahim Traore, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso. What brought them together was not diplomacy, it was destiny. The world braced for polite conversation. What unfolded instead was spiritual warfare, a clash not of egos but of ideologies, one grounded in tradition, the other burning with the urgency of a rising continent. Traore came not to argue doctrine, but to reclaim it, not to question Christ, but to question what had been done in his name. And when he opened his mouth, something ancient stirred across Africa. Stay with us, because what was said in that room may reshape the soul of a continent. If you believe in truth, dignity, and the rise of Africa, subscribe and walk this road with us. The silence in the studio was not empty, it was sacred. As the broadcast went live, the weight of history filled every inch of the room. This was not a political summit, nor a Sunday sermon. It was a reckoning. Two giants stood at the edge of a moral cliff, Bishop T.D. Jakes, whose voice had comforted millions, and Ibrahim Traore, the firebrand leader of Burkina Faso, who had shaken global narratives with the ferocity of his truth. Jakes, seated with his familiar presence, calm, wise, deeply rooted in the soil of American Black church tradition, turned his eyes toward the young president, a man who had risen from the ranks of the military to become the voice of a continent hungry for justice. Some had called him controversial, even dangerous. Others whispered that he was the kind of leader Africa hadn't seen in generations. But this moment wasn't about reputation, it was about revelation. And Jakes opened the dialogue with a question both simple and seismic. Mr. President, what does Christianity mean to your people? There was a pause, deliberate, electric. Traore adjusted his microphone, exhaled deeply, and lifted his gaze. Not just toward Jakes, but toward every African grandmother watching from her living room. Every young man in Nairobi glued to his phone. Every believer questioning their faith after centuries of silence. His voice, soft yet unwavering, sliced through the air. Christianity is not foreign to Africa, he began. Long before missionaries came, long before the empire's mass conquest with gospel, we knew the Creator. We prayed. We fasted. We walked with the divine. It was not a rejection. It was a correction. He continued, what was brought later by force was not faith. It was control. In the control room, producers exchanged nervous glances. On social media, comment threads began to bloom like wildfires. But Traore did not flinch. He spoke of how colonizers arrived with the Bible in one hand and the whip in the other. How they preached submission while stealing land, dignity, and identity. They told us to look to heaven, he said, while they built their empires here on earth. The camera caught Bishop Jakes' eyes narrowing slightly, not in disagreement, but in the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a statement, it was a historical unearthing. Yet Traore was not here to destroy, he was here to rebuild. I do not reject Christ, he clarified. I embrace him. But I reject the version of Christianity corrupted by politics, by conquest, by silence in the face of injustice. He leaned forward, his finger gently tapping the table. Jesus was not a colonizer. Jesus was a liberator. The audience responded instantly. Gasps, claps. Some wept, some raged, but no one was still. Around the world, the name Ibrahim Traore began to echo in places it had never reached. Jakes, seasoned as he was, asked what many watching had feared too. Are you saying, Mr. President, that the Christianity most of us know is false? Traore paused, his eyes locked onto Jakes. Then he spoke, slower now, each word like a bell ringing over a sleeping field. I am saying that Christianity without justice is incomplete, that a gospel which comforts the oppressor but ignores the cries of the oppressed is not the gospel of Christ. The tension in the studio was volcanic. A faith, he continued, that tells the slave to obey, but tells the master nothing about repentance. That is not the faith of Christ. And if Africa continues to follow that version, we will remain spiritually colonized even after political independence. By now, Twitter was trending with hashtags, Yajna Christianity Reclaimed, Yours Africa Speaks, Yours Troy Speaks. But the man at the center of the storm wasn't finished. He told the bishop, we must remove chains not just from our lands, but from our minds. It was as if the air changed. Even Jakes leaned back slightly, feeling the chill of uncomfortable truth meeting warm conviction. Traore then turned personal. He referenced the Exodus, how God liberated the Israelites from Pharaoh. But then he said something no African president had ever said on live TV. Africans are not waiting for another Moses. We must be our own Moses. A wave passed through the room. It was not applause. It was awe. Faith without action is empty. Prayer without justice is powerless, he said. And if we truly believe in God, then we must confront every pharaoh of our time, whether they wear crowns, suits, or operate through systems that steal our future. At that moment, this was no longer an interview. It was a sermon, a rallying cry, a declaration. Bishop Jakes looked at him silently, perhaps remembering the old stories of the civil rights movement, of Dr. King, of Malcolm, of Baldwin, and perhaps for the first time, he realized this African leader was continuing that legacy. And then, with the weight of heaven in his voice, Traore said the words that would burn themselves into memory. If your preaching does not liberate the African child from hunger, if your church does not fight for the farmer whose land is stolen, if your faith does not protect the mother dying in childbirth because hospitals lack resources, then your Christianity is just entertainment, and Africa has no more time for entertainment. He stopped. The room didn't move. Somewhere, a bishop dropped his pen. Somewhere else, a child whispered to her grandmother, "Is he a prophet?" And somewhere deep in the heart of the continent, a new fire was kindling. And this, astonishingly, was only the beginning. The stillness in the room did not mean peace, it meant pressure. The kind that builds before a storm, before glass shatters, before foundations crack. T.D. Jakes, seasoned and deeply spiritual, had spent decades commanding rooms with his words. But this time, he found himself in the presence of a different kind of preacher. A president who wielded scripture like a sword, not to decorate a pulpit, but to cut chains. The tension shifted as Traore's voice softened, not with fear, but with a deeper fire. He looked across the stage at Jakes and said, Christianity must not only teach about heaven, it must do something about hell on earth. It was not rhetorical, it was real. Then came the sentence that would divide, unite, and forever echo through pulpits and parliaments. If our Christianity does not stand with the oppressed, it is not Christianity. It is complicity. It was as though the ceiling itself sighed. The audience on set did not breathe. Cameras caught close-ups of furrowed brows, widened eyes, lips pressed tightly in reflection. Jakes, whose hands were clasped together, leaned forward. This wasn't just about doctrine anymore. It was about survival, the survival of a faith that had lost its way among chandeliers and celebrity. He asked quietly but clearly, Mr. President, are you saying the church has failed Africa? Traore's reply was not loud, but it hit with the weight of thunder. I am saying parts of it have. When churches grow richer while villages grow poorer, something is wrong. When preachers fly private, but children walk miles barefoot to fetch dirty water, something is wrong. When we shout hallelujah but ignore injustice, something is terribly wrong. Online, his words exploded. Instagram Reels clipped the quote within minutes. WhatsApp voice notes replayed the moment with voices layered over his, some praising, some panicking. In South Africa, a prominent bishop tweeted, "This young man is dangerous." In Ghana, a theologian wrote, "He speaks with the clarity of a prophet and the courage of a soldier." But the greatest reaction came not from church leaders, but from ordinary people. A market woman in Lagos, watching the interview on her neighbor's phone, wiped a tear and whispered, "Finally, someone said it." A student in Nairobi posted, "He is not just talking, he's holding the church accountable." A retired pastor in Mississippi shared the clip on Facebook with one line, He's right, and we've known it. The hashtag Troy Speaks trended within 40 minutes. Meanwhile, Jakes absorbed the words like a man in the eye of a storm. He had spent a lifetime preaching about purpose, about healing, about overcoming. And yet here sat a young African president redefining the gospel, not as words to be spoken, but as chains to be broken. Traore wasn't done. He leaned back for a moment, then leaned in again, closer to the mic, closer to the soul of the audience. The Christianity that was taught to Africa was edited, he said. They left out the verses about liberation. They forgot to teach us that Jesus turned tables, not just water into wine. Then came the high point, the moment that would echo in church halls, classrooms, political rallies. We were told to obey but not to lead, to serve but not to speak. They gave us the cross but took our gold. They gave us hymns but stole our harvest. They built cathedrals on our soil and told us to tithe while we starved. Well, the time has come to reclaim the gospel of truth, the gospel of the poor carpenter from Nazareth. And I say to Africa, it is time to rise. He paused. The silence returned, not hollow but holy. At this point, T.D. Jakes did something unexpected. He nodded, slowly, deeply, as though something inside him had shifted, as though, for all his years of preaching, he was hearing a sermon he'd long forgotten. Mr. President, he said, you are not just speaking truth, you are resurrecting it. That line, too, spread like fire. In Ethiopia, an underground pastor wept during a live stream. In Atlanta, a megachurch choir paused rehearsal to watch the full replay. In Burkina Faso, celebrations began, not in palaces, but in the streets. Traore's next move was even bolder. He shifted the conversation from history to now, from what was done to what is still being done. The church must ask itself, he said, why do our children die of hunger while pastors debate who has the bigger congregation? Why are hospitals empty while offerings are full? Why are our prayers loud, but our silence on injustice louder? At this point, T.D. Jakes had tears in his eyes. He reached for a handkerchief, not to perform, but to process. We preach about Daniel in the lion's den, Traore continued. But when our people are thrown into the dens of poverty and corruption, we do nothing. That is not faith. That is fear dressed in religious clothing. And then the final crescendo. If our faith only makes us sing, but not serve, if it teaches us to kneel, but not to stand, if it promises heaven, but delivers hell, then we must ask, who did we really follow? No one in the room dared to speak, because they knew this was not politics, it was prophecy. The crowd finally erupted, not in applause alone, but in something deeper. Some wept, some raised fists, some whispered prayers they hadn't said in years. And yet, what came next would shake not only the church, but the very soul of the continent itself. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, it would have been easy to imagine that the storm had passed. But in truth, it had only just begun. What Ibrahim Traore had unleashed on that global stage was not a moment. It was a movement. And movements, once born, refused to return to silence. In Burkina Faso, the immediate impact was felt not in headlines, but in households. Churches that once drew crowds with prosperity messages found their pews filled with uncomfortable questions. Pastors, long respected as unchallengeable voices of divine authority, now stood before congregations demanding accountability. The young people particularly were awakened. They began to ask not just what faith was, but what it had done. A mother in Ouagadougou, holding her infant at a Sunday service, turned to her pastor and whispered, "Where is the justice my president spoke of?" A teacher in Bobo Dioulasso wrote a letter to his local church. "If the Jesus you preach does not care about the hunger of my students, then maybe we need a different gospel." This was not rebellion. It was reformation. Traore had not simply criticized religious institutions. He had laid bare a deep, festering wound, the divorce between religion and reality. For years, the people had tithed faithfully. They had given their coins and crops, hoping for heaven, while earth continued to burn around them. The market prices soared, clinics lacked even basic medicines, and the rural schools had roofs made of rusted tin. Yet the churches had marble floors, and now the people were no longer afraid to speak. The ripple effect went beyond the church. Civil society organizations began quoting Traore in workshops and seminars. University professors in Dakar, Accra, and Nairobi added his remarks to syllabi on decolonization and theology. Activist groups referenced his speech not just as political rhetoric, but as a blueprint for spiritual resistance. One student leader at the University of Ghana declared, "We are not anti-God, we are anti-hypocrisy." But the unrest wasn't limited to intellectual spaces. In the heartland of Burkina Faso, farmers gathered not to protest but to pray. Differently. This time their prayers were not simply for rain or good harvests, but for justice in land ownership, for an end to deals that handed ancestral soil to foreign companies under the guise of development. Traore's words had awakened them to a sacred truth. That land too is spiritual, that justice is a form of worship. The political system too began to feel the aftershocks. Some within Traore's own government warned him to tone down the rhetoric. "You're picking a fight with both the church and the West," one advisor cautioned, to which Traore reportedly replied, "I would rather walk alone in truth than be applauded in silence." This resolve only deepened his support among the people. International donors, however, raised eyebrows. Some began questioning whether Burkina Faso was becoming too radicalized. One European official privately commented, "Faith and politics must be separated. This blend is dangerous." But for Traore, the point was clear. The problem is not that we mix faith and politics. The problem is that we have divorced both from justice. In response to the broadcast, a network of pastors from Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa signed a statement calling for a return to the Christ of the margins. They wrote, "Traore has reminded us that the gospel is not a brand. It is a burden, one that demands we lift up the lowest among us." And yet, not all welcomed his words. Some megachurch leaders in Lagos and Johannesburg pushed back publicly. "He is not a theologian," one bishop remarked. "He is a politician with a dangerous tongue." Another accused Traore of inciting division among believers. But the truth was, the division already existed. He had simply exposed it. And beyond the continent, the diaspora was listening. In Harlem, a group of African-American pastors met to discuss the speech. One elder, gray-bearded and leaning on his cane, said, "I've waited 60 years for someone to speak like this from Africa. Now let's not leave him alone." Across Caribbean churches in Jamaica, Haiti, and Trinidad, sermons the following Sunday included phrases like "Reclaiming the Gospel," "Jesus the Liberator," and "Africa Rising." The connection was unmistakable. The impact also rippled through policy. In the weeks following the interview, the Traore administration launched new audits into faith-based charities and NGOs operating in Burkina Faso. The goal to track whether funds were truly reaching the poor or simply enriching bureaucracies. Several organizations quietly shut down their operations rather than face scrutiny. Traore then made a televised statement echoing his interview. "We will support any faith that supports justice, but we will no longer tolerate faith being used as a cloak for exploitation." His critics called it state interference. His supporters called it long overdue. The streets of Ouagadougou began to see new graffiti. "Let my people go. No justice, no gospel. This is our exodus." It was not coordinated. It was spontaneous, and that made it all the more powerful. The cultural shift was also visible in music. A new wave of gospel artists emerged, writing songs that echoed Traore's message. One young artist released a track titled "Not Entertainment," featuring clips from the president's speech layered over drum beats and spiritual chants. Radio stations began to host late-night call-ins with listeners debating theology and accountability. The country was not losing faith. It was rediscovering it. In one village, an elderly man was asked what he thought of the president's statements. He replied with a quiet smile, "My grandson finally believes that Jesus is for him, not just for Europe." And while Traore's voice echoed across Africa, the world's superpowers began to take notice and prepare their own response. Far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, in capitals where power is spoken in polished diplomacy and strategic silence, Traore's words stirred more than just spiritual reflection. they stirred unease. In Washington, D.C., analysts at think tanks replayed clips of the broadcast, not as theologians, but as geopolitical tacticians. The young African president had not only challenged Western narratives, he had reframed them, and not through anti-American slogans, but through theological truths that echoed into the halls of history. One U.S. State Department insider reportedly said, "This isn't just a speech. This is ideological disruption, and it's spreading." What worried many wasn't just what Ibrahim Traore said, it was who was listening. Young Africans, the diaspora, disillusioned Christians across the global South, and perhaps most significantly, Black Americans who had long wrestled with the contradictions of their inherited faith. In Atlanta, major Black churches convened emergency pastoral roundtables. The questions being raised were seismic. Is the gospel we preach aligned with the liberation Jesus lived? Have we traded prophetic fire for pulpit fame? Are we still speaking truth or just maintaining platforms? Bishop T.D. Jakes, now at the center of the spiritual whirlwind, remained publicly silent for days. Behind closed doors, he met with senior ministers, advisors, and elders of the church. One anonymous source said, "He was shaken, not by disrespect, but by conviction." The president didn't attack him. He reminded him. In Europe, the Vatican monitored the conversation with cautious observation. The notion of Christianity as conquest was not new in theological circles, but to hear it declared by a sitting head of state to millions was unprecedented. Meanwhile, in France, where the colonial memory still lingers heavily over Francophone Africa, political commentators debated the implications. A major French daily asked bluntly, "Is Traore trying to decolonize religion itself?" Elsewhere, Russia and China, ever watchful of ideological openings in Africa, quietly applauded the shift. Traore's message, though deeply spiritual, also carved out space for alternative alliances, ones not based on paternalism, but on sovereignty. But Traore was no pawn. He made it clear, we are not exchanging one master for another. We are reclaiming our minds, our lands, and our faith. In Nigeria, the largest Christian population in Africa, public reaction was split. Megachurch pastors responded with carefully worded statements defending prosperity theology, while grassroots Christian movements rallied around Traore's message, launching campaigns titled Gospel of Justice and Back to Christ. Even in the Caribbean, echoes of Traore's fire were heard in Sunday sermons and street protests. In Trinidad, one pastor declared, "We've danced long enough. Now it's time to deliver." The global media tried to reduce the story to a soundbite, but what had occurred could not be easily summarized. It was spiritual, political, historical, and above all, unstoppable. In the corridors of power, policy briefings were updated. In churches, sermons were rewritten. In homes, families talked openly about Jesus, justice, and the need for a new kind of faith. And as the world reacted, Africa stood at a crossroads between the echoes of empire and the voice of resurrection. When the echoes of that sacred conversation finally settled, one truth remained. Africa had been given a choice, not from outside powers, not from missionary hands, but from within, a choice about the soul of its future. Ibrahim Traore, in speaking not as a priest, but as a president, had lit a torch that many feared to hold. He had dared to declare that faith without justice is not sacred, but dangerous. And now the question before the continent was clear. What comes next? For Traore, and for those stirred by his words, the answer was not revolution of rage, but revival of roots. In public addresses following the interview, he outlined a simple yet radical vision. Africa must return to Christ, not the Christ of cathedrals and colonizers, but the Christ of dust roads and deep compassion. He called for a new kind of leadership, one that worships not through words, but through policies that feed, heal, educate, and protect. A Christianity where offerings build clinics, not stages, where sermons become school books, where pulpits empower, not perform. The blueprint he described looked remarkably like the earliest church in Acts chapter 2, where no one was in need, where everything was shared, and where faith was a community, not a competition. In response, grassroots movements began forming. In Senegal, a collective of youth leaders created a project called Bread Before Buildings, redirecting church funds to buy bread and medicine before expanding structures. In Zambia, a new wave of female-led prayer circles prioritized microloans for widows before worship events. From Nairobi to Kumasi, a whisper turned to a wave. Let our faith be seen in how we live, not just in how we sing. The spiritual shift also pointed to political clarity. No longer could leaders claim righteousness while their people perished. No longer could churches promise prosperity while their communities sank in poverty. The people were watching and they were remembering. Africa for centuries had been told what to believe. Now it was deciding what to live for. Traore's message was not isolationist. In fact, he invited global Christians to walk with Africa, but as partners, not patrons. As listeners, not lecturers. We don't want pity, he said. We want justice. We don't seek charity. We seek dignity. If you come to us, come with open hearts, not full pockets and empty empathy. And so the continent stands at the threshold of something new. Not perfect, but possible. Not easy, but essential. A new rhythm is rising, one where the name of Jesus no longer arrives chained to empire, but flows freely through the lips of those who know him, not as a conqueror, but as a companion. This is not a new religion. It is a return, a reclaiming, a resurrection, and at the heart of it beats a simple truth. Africa Rising is not just an economic slogan. It is a spiritual awakening. And as that awakening takes root, a new question echoes from village huts to city halls. Will we answer the call, or will we let it pass us by? In the quiet that followed that historic conversation, the world seemed to hold its breath, not because of what had ended, but because of what had just begun. Two men, seated across from one another, had not debated doctrine. They had ignited a reformation. Ibrahim Traore, though not a preacher by title, had spoken with the authority of lived experience. And Bishop T.D. Jakes, though weathered by years of ministry, had listened with the humility of a disciple. Their exchange did not answer every question, but it asked the ones that matter most. Is our Christianity comfortable or courageous? Does our faith feed the hungry or just fill the pews? Do we follow Christ or only the version we've been handed? These questions now rest not in church halls or government offices, but in every heart that dares to believe in something greater. Across Africa, a new wind is rising, not of rebellion, but of remembrance. A remembering of the Jesus who walked barefoot, who healed without charging, who wept with the broken, and who stood against the empires of his time. This is the gospel that calls not just for salvation, but for transformation. And now the path forward is clear. To every elder who prayed for justice, to every youth searching for purpose, to every pastor wrestling with truth. Know this, Africa Rising is not a myth, it is a mandate. And the world will not rise with us until we rise in spirit, in truth, and in justice. If this story moves something in your chest, do not just scroll, like, share, and speak up. Subscribe. Our history was muted for too long. Let us say our future out loud. Let the comments section become a call to courage. New Africa. Africa Rise. Africa can do it. It's time for Africa. Because the journey has just begun. And as long as we walk with truth, with dignity, and with the heart of Christ, Ibrahim Traore will not be alone. He is not just one man. He is the echo of a continent rediscovering its voice.